Three men were standing behind my fence at 7:42 in the morning with chainsaws, orange paint, and the kind of confidence people only have when they are absolutely wrong. One of them had his hand on the trunk of my black walnut tree like he was checking the hood of the used pickup, and another one was reading from a clipboard that apparently gave him permission to destroy the one thing in my backyard I would have fought harder for than my actual patio furniture. And the wildest part was, they were not sneaking around. They were not embarrassed. They were not even unsure. They genuinely believed my neighborhood association had the right to send them there. My name is Ethan Mercer, and for almost 18 years, I lived on Briarstone Court, one of those quiet little suburban streets outside Columbus where people wave from behind steering wheels, pretend they do not notice your Christmas lights are still up in February, and say things like we should all get coffee sometime even though everybody knows nobody is getting coffee. I was not the neighborhood rebel. I was not the guy with a boat parked sideways in the driveway or a lawn full of political sign. I paid my dues, trimmed my hedges, kept my trash cans hidden like they were fugitives, and for the most part, I believed the homeowners association was annoying but useful, kind of like dental floss. Then Margaret Voss became president. Now Margaret was not loud, and that made her more dangerous. Loud people warn you. Margaret moved quietly, with a pearl necklace, a tablet in a leather case, and a smile so tight it looked like it had been approved by committee. She had been on the board for years, but once she became president, everything changed in that slow, creeping way that makes you question whether you are overreacting until suddenly you are standing barefoot in wet grass telling strangers not to cut down your tree. The black walnut stood at the back corner of my yard, just inside my property line, tall and wide and stubborn, probably around 50 years old, maybe older, with a canopy that turned the whole yard into a cool green room every summer. My wife, Nora, used to say that tree was the reason we bought the house, although technically we bought the house because the mortgage was barely affordable and the school district was good. But she was right in the way wives usually are when they say something casually, and then you spend years realizing it was true. Our oldest boy, Caleb, built a crooked birdhouse on one of the lower branches when he was 9. Our daughter, Lily, used to collect the walnuts in a red beach bucket and try to sell them back to me for $1 each, which, honestly, was a better business model than half the startups I've heard about. And after Nora got sick, that tree became something else entirely. She would sit under it in the late afternoon with a blanket over her knees, watching the leaves move, pretending she was not exhausted, and I would sit beside her pretending I was not terrified. So when people talk about landscaping like it is just mulch and branches and curb appeal, I try not to laugh in their face, because sometimes a tree is not a tree. Sometimes it is where your life happened, one you were too busy living it to notice. The first sign of trouble came in the form of a cream-colored envelope with the Briarstone Commons Association seal printed at the top, which already told me the news inside was going to be either expensive, insulting, or both. I opened it standing at the kitchen counter, still in my work shirt, and read that the black walnut on my property had been identified as a recurring nuisance due to debris, shade interference, and negative visual impact on the shared walking path behind my lot. Shade interference. I read that phrase 3 times because I thought maybe my eyes had slipped. Apparently, my tree was now guilty of casting shade in a neighborhood where every sales brochure bragged about mature trees. The letter gave me 45 days to remove it or face escalating fines. Nora was gone by then, and I remember looking toward the backyard like I expected her to say something from the doorway. Maybe something dry and perfect like, "Well, Ethan, I guess the son hired a lawyer." Instead, the house was quiet. I folded the letter, unfolded it, read it again, and felt that slow heat crawl up my neck. The kind that comes when somebody is not just wrong, but wrong with stationery. I called Margaret that evening because I still believed adults could solve stupid problems before they became expensive ones. She answered with that polished board meeting voice and said, "Ethan, I understand change can feel personal, but the association has a responsibility to protect the appearance of the community." I said, "Margaret, it is a tree." She said, "It is a maintenance burden." I said, "Leaves fall. That is kind of their whole deal." There was a pause, and I could almost hear her deciding whether I was being funny or difficult. Then she said, "The board has received complaints." That was the first time I felt something underneath the rule talk, something sharper. Complaints from who? She would not say. Later, I found out the complaints mostly came from one person, her friend, a next-door ally, Doug Fenwick, who lived across the walking path and had been trying for years to get a clearer view of the little retention pond behind our houses. Doug called it improving sightlines, which is a fancy way of saying he wanted my property to make his breakfast view prettier. Margaret did not mention that. Of course. She just repeated community standards until the words stopped meaning anything. I hung up with my hand shaking, not because I was scared, exactly, but because I could feel the shape of the fight forming, and I hated that. I had spent enough years caring for Nora to know how little energy a person really has, and how foolish it is to waste it on petty people. But grief does something strange to you. It can make you tired, yes, but it can also make certain lines very clear. That tree had shaded my wife through the worst afternoons of her life. It had no idea what it meant to me, because trees do not know they are witnesses, but I knew. So the next morning, instead of writing an angry email that would have felt good for about 12 seconds and then made me look like a lunatic, I called a certified arborist named Ray Donnelly. Ray showed up in a faded green truck with mud on the tires and a face that looked like it had spent 30 years squinting into sunlight. He did not talk much at first. He walked around the tree slowly, looked at the trunk, the root flare, the canopy, the soil, then tapped one branch with a pole and nodded to himself like a tree had answered the question. Finally, he looked at me and said, "Whoever called this tree a nuisance does not understand trees, or they understand them just fine and hope you do not." I remember laughing once, not because it was funny, but because it was the first sane sentence I had heard in a week. Ray spent nearly 2 hours documenting everything. He took photographs, measurements, core samples, notes about limb structure, health, location, and environmental value. Before he left, he said something I did not fully appreciate until later. "Mature trees are not lawn ornaments, Mr. Mercer, legally and financially. They can be assets." A few days later, his report landed in my inbox. I printed it at the kitchen table, the same table where Nora used to sort medical bills into piles we could understand and piles we had to pretend we understood, and halfway down page 6, there it was. The estimated replacement and loss value, $226,000. I stared at that number for so long my coffee went cold. $226,000 for the thing Margaret had described like a dirty doormat. That was the moment the whole situation changed. It was not just sentimental anymore. It was property. It was liability. It was a number big enough to make polite people suddenly remember the law. After that, I went digging. I pulled the association covenants from the county records site, printed the bylaws, the amendments, the architectural guidelines, even the meeting minutes from the past year, and spread them across my dining room like a man trying to solve a murder in a cable drama. And there it was, buried under all the dull language people count on you never reading. The association could require vegetation removal only if there was documented disease, danger to structures, obstruction of easements, or confirmed damage to common property. Not shade, not walnuts, not Doug Fennick wanting a better pond view. I read that paragraph again and again, and with every pass, my anger got quieter, colder, and a lot more useful. By the end of the weekend, I had the arborist report, a property survey, photos, and the exact covenant language highlighted in yellow. Then I called an attorney named Marissa Cole, who listened to the whole story without interrupting, which made me trust her immediately. When I finished, she asked one question. "Did the board ever vote to authorize action on your property?" I said, "Not that I know of." She said, "Good." Then she asked, "Did they receive notice that you dispute their authority?" I said, "They will," and that was the first time I smiled. We sent Margaret a certified letter the next day, calm, professional, and sharp enough to shave with, explaining that the tree was healthy, privately owned, protected by the governing documents, and valued at more than most of the homes on our street had cost when they were first built. I thought that would end it. I thought any reasonable person would read the report, see the number, understand the risk, and back away before pride turned into disaster. But Margaret Voss was not done proving she had power, and 2 weeks later, she made the mistake that would turn a neighborhood argument into the most expensive silence I have ever heard. The second letter came on a Tuesday, folded perfectly, mailed officially, and somehow even more insulting than the first one, because it did not mention Ray Donnelly. It did not mention the property survey. It did not mention the bylaws. It did not mention the $226,000 valuation. It just repeated the same demand in colder language. Remove the tree within 15 days or face daily fines and further enforcement action. I stood in the kitchen reading it with one hand on the counter, and I remember thinking there is a special kind of arrogance in ignoring a warning that comes with certified mail and an attorney's signature. Margaret had not misunderstood. She had made a choice. She had looked at facts, law, property lines, financial risk, and one grieving widower who just wanted to be left alone under his own tree. And she had decided the only thing that mattered was whether people still believed she was in charge. I called Marissa, and when I read the letter to her, she did not gasp or curse or say anything dramatic. She just went quiet for a second, then said, "Keep the envelope." That was how I knew things were getting serious. Attorneys have a way of making ordinary sentences sound like someone just moved a chess piece. Over the next week, Briarstone started doing what neighborhoods do when conflict smells better than barbecue. People who had not spoken to me in months suddenly slowed down while walking their dogs. One man pretended to adjust his earbuds for almost 30 seconds near my driveway before finally asking if it was true I was fighting the board. Mrs. Moles Klein, who lived 2 doors down and had the most aggressive garden gnomes I have ever seen, leaned over her boxwoods and whispered, "Good for you," like we were smuggling state secrets. But nobody wanted to say too much in public. That was the thing about Margaret. She did not scare people in a movie villain way. She scared them in a lesser, unofficial, letterhead way. She could make your life inconvenient. She could fine you $50 because your trash cans were visible from the sidewalk for 20 extra minutes. She could delay approval for your fence, question your paint color, or make you attend a meeting where adults discussed mulch tone with the seriousness of international diplomacy. Most people would rather pay a stupid fine than become her next hobby. And for a while, I understood them. I really did. Then Doug Fenwick cornered me by the mailboxes. Doug always dressed like he was on his way to inspect a yacht he did not own. Pressed polo, clean sneakers, sunglasses pushed up into his hair, even when the sky was grey. He nodded toward my backyard and said, "Ethan, nobody wants this to get ugly." I said, "Funny, because sending threats about my property has a certain ugly flavor already." He smiled without smiling. "Come on. You know that tree drops walnuts all over the common path. Somebody could twist an ankle." I looked at him and said, "Doug, last year you stepped on your own driveway carrying a blender full of margaritas. Should we remove tequila from the neighborhood too?" His face tightened, and for one beautiful second, I thought he might actually laugh. But he did not. He leaned closer and said, "Some of us care about property values." That was when I understood him completely. This was never about safety. It was not even really about walnuts. Doug wanted a cleaner view from his breakfast nook. Margaret wanted a clean demonstration of power, and my tree had become the object they could both point at while pretending they were serving the community. I went home with that conversation burning in my head, and that evening I sat under the walnut as the sun slid behind the houses, the same way Nora and I used to sit when the day had worn us both down. The leaves moved above me, slow and patient, and I thought about how power often disguises itself as concern. People rarely say, "I want control." They say, "It is for everyone." They say, "It is about standards." They say, "Surely you understand." But behind all that soft language, somebody is usually trying to decide what belongs to somebody else. Thursday morning was cold enough that the grass felt wet through my socks when I ran outside. I had been pouring coffee, half awake, wearing an old Ohio State sweatshirt Nora hated because the cuffs were frayed, when I had the low beep of a truck backing up behind the fence. At first I thought it was the landscaping crew for the common area, but then I looked through the kitchen window and saw 3 men step out of a white truck with chainsaws, cones, a roll of caution tape, and orange marking paint. One of them pointed directly at my black walnut. Another unfolded a work order. My body moved before my brain caught up. I set the mug down too hard. Coffee splashed across the counter, and I was out the back door barefoot, heart banging in my chest like I had just heard someone breaking into the house. The oldest worker saw me coming and lifted one hand, friendly enough, like we were about to talk about gutter cleaning. "Morning, sir. We are here for the tree removal." I said no. "You are not." He blinked. "We were hired by the Braston Commons Association." I stepped between him and the trunk. "Then they lied to you. This is private property." He looked uncomfortable, and that mattered to me, because I could tell he was not trying to hurt anybody. He was a working guy who had been sent to do a job by people who should have known better. The younger one, maybe 25, glanced at the chainsaw in his hand like it had suddenly become evidence. "Sir, we were told authorization was handled." I said, "I am the authorization. I am telling you it was not handled." The older worker unfolded his papers and showed me the order. "Remove black walnut at rear boundary. Nuisance vegetation. Association approved." I actually laughed, just once, because sometimes the human body has no better response to insanity. "Association approved." I said, "Do you know who owns the dirt under your boots?" He did not answer. I pulled up the survey on my phone, then grabbed the printed copy from the folder I had started keeping by the back door because Marissa had told me. Ethan, paranoid is just prepared with a bad reputation. I pointed to the property line, the fence, the marked trunk location. Everything on this side is mine. That tree is mine. If you cut it, damage it, paint it, or so much as carve your initials in it, your company gets dragged into a lawsuit before lunch, and the association gets dragged in right behind you. The three of them looked at one another. The youngest one took 2 steps back. The older one rubbed his jaw, then said, "Let me make a call." So we all stood there in the cold morning air, under that enormous canopy, while he called whoever had sent them. I could only hear his side of it. "Yeah, we are on site. Homeowner is here. Says it is private property. Says he has legal counsel. No, we have not started. No, I'm not touching it until somebody confirms." Then a longer pause. His face changed a little during that pause, not dramatically, but enough. He looked at me, then at the tree, then at his crew, and said into the phone, "I understand what you are saying, but I am not putting my license on the line for a disputed removal." He hung up and gave me the tired smile of a man who had just chosen paperwork over disaster. "We are going to pack up," I said. "That is the smartest thing anybody has done all week." They loaded the equipment back into the truck, and as they drove away, I stood there shaking, not with victory, not yet, but with the aftershock of realizing how close I had come to hearing that first bite of metal into bark. 10 minutes, 5 maybe, if I had been in the shower, if I had gone to the grocery store, if I had slept in. The tree Nora loved might have been lying across the yard by noon, and Margaret would have called it compliance. I took pictures of the tire marks, the cones, the footprints, the spot where the truck had backed in. Then I checked my little garage camera and found enough footage to make Marissa very happy in the calm, terrifying way attorneys get happy. She told me to send everything, then said, "Now call Margaret." I did not want to. That surprised me. I had imagined the moment a dozen times, imagined myself delivering some perfect line, imagined making her feel small. But when the chance came, I was just tired. Still, I called. She answered on the 3rd ring. "Ethan," she said, in a tone already prepared to be disappointed in me. I said, "Margaret, your contractors were just on my property with chainsaws." She sighed. "The association has authority to correct unresolved violations." "No," I said. "You have authority to hold meetings and send letters that make people roll their eyes. You do not have authority to trespass onto my land and destroy an asset valued at $226,000. The line went silent. Not quiet. Silent. That kind of silence where you can almost hear someone recalculating their entire personality. "Finally," she said, "I think this should be discussed with the full board." I said, "That is the first thing you have said that makes sense." By sundown, an emergency meeting notice had gone out to every homeowner in Briarstone Commons. The subject line said Vegetation Enforcement Review, which was such a soft little phrase for 3 men with chainsaws that I almost admired it. Marissa called that evening and told me she would attend with me. "Bring every letter, every photo, every report," she said. "And Ethan, let them talk first." Why? Because people who overstepped usually explained the overstep better than we ever could. The meeting was scheduled for Saturday morning at the clubhouse, and that night I slept badly, drifting in and out of dreams where I heard chainsaws starting somewhere I could not see. Before I left the house, I walked into the backyard and stood under the walnut, one hand on the bark, feeling ridiculous and completely serious at the same time. I thought about Nora, about how she used to tell me I was too patient with people who mistook patience for weakness. Then I locked the back door, picked up my folder, and drove to the clubhouse, where Margaret Voss was already sitting at the front table with her pearl necklace, her leather tablet case, and the tightest smile I had ever seen. The clubhouse smelled like burned coffee, floor cleaner, and fear pretending to be civic responsibility. I had been in that room plenty of times before, for budget meetings, holiday decoration votes, one unforgettable argument about whether beige and sand were technically different fence colors. But that morning the whole place felt different. Nobody was chatting by the snack table. Nobody was laughing too loudly at jokes that were not funny. People watched me walk in the way passengers watch a man board a plane while holding a parachute. Marissa walked beside me carrying a black binder so thick it looked like it had its own mortgage, and she did not smile at Margaret, which somehow felt more aggressive than yelling. Margaret sat at the front table with the other board members, spine straight, hands folded, pearls glowing under the fluorescent lights like she was about to judge a county fair pie contest, instead of explain why she sent chainsaws onto private property. Doug Fenwick sat in the second row with his arms crossed, staring at the wall like he had no connection to any of this, which was funny considering his fingerprints were all over the situation without him ever touching the tree. Margaret opened the meeting with that soft official voice of hers and said the board was here to address an ongoing vegetation enforcement matter involving a non-compliant homeowner. Non-compliant. I almost laughed, but Marissa touched her pen once against the table, just once, and I remembered what she had told me. Let them talk first. So I sat there and let Margaret build her own little bridge out over the canyon. She talked about community aesthetics, maintenance burden, fairness to other residents, preserving property values, and the need for decisive leadership when homeowners refuse to cooperate. The longer she spoke, the more I realized she truly believed tone could replace evidence. Then she said the removal crew had been dispatched only after repeated good faith efforts failed. Marissa looked up at that. She did not interrupt. She just looked up, and Margaret saw it, and for the first time her voice caught a little. When Margaret finished, the room stayed quiet. Then Marissa stood, buttoned her jacket, and said, "For the record, my client has not refused cooperation. He has refused unlawful interference with his private property." She passed copies of the arborist report, the survey, the covenant language, the certified letter, and the security camera stills down the board table. Pages started turning, and I swear that sound was more satisfying than applause. The first board member to speak was a retired firefighter named Bill Hargrove, a man who usually looked bored at every meeting because once you have run into burning buildings, mulch rules probably lose their sparkle. He pointed at the report and said, "This says the tree is healthy." Margaret nodded tightly and said, "Yes, but there are ongoing concerns." Bill said, "Whose concerns?" Margaret hesitated. Then Linda Park, the board treasurer, adjusted her glasses and read from the bylaws. Documented disease, hazard to structures, obstruction of easement, or confirmed damage to common property. She looked up. "Where is the documentation showing any of those?" Margaret shifted in her chair. "The falling walnuts create risk." "That Cassin. Do we have an incident report?" "No." "A maintenance report?" "No." "A legal opinion?" "No." "A board vote approving contractors to enter Mr. Mercer property?" Margaret went still. "Not a full board vote," she said. "Not a full board vote is one of those phrases people use when the real answer is no, but they are trying to dress it in a cardigan." Marissa slid the photographs forward, one by one, showing the truck, the cones, the workers, the chainsaws, the paint, all of it right there beside my tree. Then she said, "The association was placed on written notice that the demand was disputed, unsupported by the governing documents, and involved privately owned property. After receiving that notice, someone still authorized a crew to attempt removal of an asset valued at $226,000. The number landed in the room like somebody had dropped a brick on the table. Doug finally turned his head. Margaret looked at the binder in front of her, then at me, and for 1 second I saw the person behind the title. Not evil, not cartoonish, just trapped by her own need to be obeyed. She said, "I acted in what I believed was the best interest of the community." And maybe part of her believed that. Maybe that was the scariest thing. People can do a lot of damage when they convince themselves their preferences are principles. Bill leaned back and said, "Margaret, did you disclose that the primary complaint came from Mr. Fenwick? It was asked before about clearing that view line behind his home." Doug sat up like somebody had stepped on his tail. "That is irrelevant," he said. Linda looked at him and said, "It is not irrelevant if private preference was presented as community need." The room murmured then, softly at first, then louder. Neighbors turning toward each other, little pieces clicking into place. Mrs. Klein whispered something that made the woman beside her cover her mouth. I did not feel triumphant. That surprised me. I thought I would. I thought watching Margaret squirm would feel like justice with a bow on it. But mostly I felt sad and angry and exhausted, because all of this had been avoidable. One apology, one honest review, one adult willing to say maybe we went too far, and nobody would have needed lawyers, emergency meetings, or security footage of chainsaws beside a widower backyard tree. Marissa ended simply. She did not perform. She did not threaten the room like a movie lawyer. She said the violation should be rescinded immediately, all fines removed, written confirmation provided, and the association should preserve all records related to the attempted removal. Preserve all records is another one of those attorney phrases that sounds polite until you realize it means do not even think about deleting anything. The vote took less than 5 minutes, 6-1. The board rescinded the violation. Margaret voted against it. Of course she did. Pride does not usually die in public. It just changes clothes and calls itself principal. The gavel came down, and just like that, 45 days of threats, fines, letters, and sleepless nights disappeared into the same stale clubhouse air where they had been created. As people stood to leave, Bill came over and shook my hand. Mrs. Klein hugged me, which was dangerous because she was about 5 feet tall and stronger than she looked. Doug walked past without saying a word. Margaret stayed seated, staring down at her tablet, and for a moment I almost said something to her. Something sharp, something I had earned, but I did not. I just walked outside into the cool morning sun. 2 weeks later, Briarstone Commons announced that Margaret Voss had resigned as president for personal reasons. That was the official lie. Around the neighborhood, people had other versions, most of them whispered by mailboxes and delivered with the kind of dramatic pauses suburban people pretend they do not enjoy. A month after that, I received a formal letter confirming that the black walnut stood entirely on my property, that no current covenant required its removal, and that any future action involving private property would require documented evidence, board approval, and legal review. I put that letter in the same folder as the first violation notice, because some stories deserve to keep their beginning and ending in the same place. These days, the tree is still there. It still drops leaves. It still drops walnuts. It still throws shade over half the yard like a champion. And every now and then one rolls onto the walking path and somehow civilization survives. In the fall, when the light turns gold and the branches start thinning out, I sit under it with a cup of coffee and think about Nora. I think about how close I came to losing something irreplaceable because a few people confused authority with ownership. And I think about the question that still bothers me. If I had not been home that morning, if I had not hired Ray, if I had not read the bylaws, if I had not had the money and stubbornness to cool Marissa, would anyone have admitted they were wrong after the tree was gone? Or would Margaret have stood at the next meeting, smiled that tight little smile, and called it a community improvement? So I want to know what you think. Was Margaret trying to protect the neighborhood? Or was this power going too far? Was Doug just a concerned resident? Or was he using the HOA to get something he could never legally demand on his own? And if you looked out your kitchen window and saw strangers walking towards something you loved with chainsaws, but you have done, drop your thoughts in the comments. Because communities do not fall apart all at once. They fall apart one quiet overreach at a time. And sometimes the only thing standing between fairness and a very expensive mistake is one person willing to say, no, not on my property.